Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness, where we embark on a journey through the stunning landscapes of our national parks and public lands, expanding our understanding of climate justice and Indigenous justice along the way. I'm Elizabeth Dorr, your guide in exploring the rich tapestry of our national parks and public lands, discovering not only their breathtaking beauty, but also the vital lessons they hold for our planet's future, as well as the challenging history and current political context of these parks and public lands. Join me as I talk to inspiring, innovative, and driven people working in environmental justice, climate science, Indigenous education, equity in the outdoors, and more to delve into pressing environmental issues and learn how we can advocate for a more equitable and sustainable world for all. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Charm of the Wilderness. I'm really excited to introduce you to Will DeMann. Will is a Michigan-based educator, writer, and public land advocate. He is the author of 2 books on the history and origins of our national parks, history contributor for the National Park Explorer, and a Spring 2026 Trusted Creator Fellow with News Creator Corps. His content on Instagram and Substack combines history and advocacy to help his audience understand and respond to the many issues our public lands and national parks are facing, which in these current times with this current administration is quite a lot. So it's very helpful for all of us to keep up on that. Will has partnered with the Wilderness Society, Protect the Porkies. Is that what it is?
Yep.
I love it. I'll have to learn about that.
That's an organization that is focused on Porcupine Mountain State Park, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And they're not actually mountains, but they're the closest we get in Michigan. So we all call them Porcupine Mountains. And yeah, there's a mine that wants to go in right next to that park, which we do not want to happen. It's very similar to the Boundary Water situation.
Okay, so, well, we'll have to talk about that, but that is awesome. Also, the best name for an advocacy group is Protect the Porkies. And he's also partnered with other creators to defend national monuments, protect state parks, and keep public lands in public hands. And that's why I brought him on, because that is what Charm of the Wilderness is about. Part of it is kind of relearning and unlearning the idea of what the term wilderness is, which I know you address as well in your books, but it is also about protecting these public lands, because despite the kind of interesting history behind them, they still are so essential to America. So thank you for being here, Will. It's really a pleasure to meet you, and I'm excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, it's a pleasure for me also. I am an educator. I'm a history teacher, during the day. And so this is one of the things I'm super passionate about, is just learning things about the past and being able to bring it to other people. So that's kind of, the mission behind Substack and Instagram for me. And it is, why when you reached out, I was like, yep, absolutely. I'd love to come on and talk more about the history of the national parks.
Yay, I'm excited to have you here. Well, yeah, let's start there. Tell me about yourself and how you came to write your books and your Substack. And also tell us about the books that you have. One that just came out, or we are actually recording this a few weeks before it comes out, but by the time you're listening to this, it will be ready to purchase. So yeah, tell us about those and your Substack.
Yeah, so it was an interesting origin story for me. When I was doing my undergrad, I did a minor in classical studies, which is kind of a dying field. It's all the Greek and Roman stuff. I took Latin. I read all of the Iliad and the Odyssey and all that sorts of stuff, and I wrote all kinds of papers about them. And I just love that. And then I'm lucky enough now to teach 7th grade history, which in the state of Michigan is ancient history. So I'm putting all of that to good use. And I always thought that would be kind of like my niche as a history educator, is just like really diving into that. But then in 2022, my wife and I bought an old camper van. It was a 1991 Road Trek. Got it for a great deal. Everything worked on it mechanically, but like the inside camper part was not in great condition. So this was my first year teaching, and every night I would come home, and as long as my teaching stuff was figured out for the next day, which was not always a given, I would work on the camper van. I put solar panels onto it. I redid a bunch of plumbing. This thing was my baby. I'd wanted a camper van since I was like 12 years old. I just thought like it was the perfect way to get outside. I hated setting up camp and all this sort of stuff.
Oh my gosh.
Just being able to park
Same.
is like the dream. So
Same. We are actually getting one next month. We have like
fantastic.
we're doing we went the more expensive route. We were like we just can't handle the build ourselves. But that is the exact same reason, is because I love camping. I hate the logistics.
Yes, absolutely. Well, good for you for, like purchasing one that's probably all ready to go, because we went out with the camper van, we visited some local parks, and then my wife she'd been to Utah before, and she was like, we got to go and do all the parks in Utah. And so there's a huge story there that involves like the camper van breaking down and getting towed and getting fixed and all this sorts of stuff. But for the purpose of this conversation, I'll just keep it to, we end up in Capitol Reef National Park. Okay. And we plan to be there. And I'm going through the materials, reading the signs as I do. And I'm just like, this park does an excellent job of interpreting not just the landscape, the science of the water pocket fold and that sorts of stuff, but it does a good job of interpreting its own history. We stopped by, one thing that really stuck out to me was stopping at the Behunin cabin, which is on the road that leads into Capitol Reef from the east, and getting out and reading the plaque about the Behunin family and how they lived in this teeny tiny, like basically like mud house that's like the size of my office that I'm in right now. That to me was fascinating, and I wanted more of that. And my wife and I had been to 5 national parks at this point, had a few more left on our trip, and I was just like, I want to know more about the actual story of the park. The phrase I always use is, I want to know who first came to this landscape and said every American has to see this. And so that really sparked something inside of me. And, like I said, when I was in college, did all of this work in classical studies and learned to just love doing research from that. Love digging into papers, digging into, scholarly stuff and trying to put it together and create some sort of like new narrative out of it. And so that kind of sparked this, this idea for me of like, well, what if I can just kind of do my own mini research project? And I did lots of research trying to find easily accessible books about the history of national parks. And all I could find was stuff that was pretty academic, stuff that was pretty not where I felt like it should be. I felt like the history should be like pretty accessible for all Americans. Kind of in my mind, there should be books that like were available to like an 8 or 9-year-old, because I can imagine myself as an 8 or 9-year-old wanting that kind of book. And so I was like, I'm going to take this research project, I'm going to turn it into a book. And that's what became my first book, A Short History of the National Parks, the Southeast, which is the story of 8 national parks. They're really short chapters, and they're all kind of formulaic. They start with the indigenous history of the park, and they go through kind of the settlement and development into some sort of threat that prompts people into a movement to establish national park. So that's my kind of national park history origin. And then how I ended up where I am now, which is in much more of an advocacy position. It all started really this time last year, when just things started to get really bad.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
It really kicked off with what lots of people call the Valentine's Day Massacre, when all of the rangers and public land staff were fired by Doge. And I was on midwinter break for my school. My wife and I were up at a little cabin with our son. He's 3 now, and we were all really sick, actually. We were all like throwing up,
Oh, no.
It's just a great way to spend a vacation. But so we're all just watching. I'm just reading all these news articles about the terrible stuff that's happening. And so I got on my Instagram and I just made like a really simple post. It was just one of those posts where like you open up your notes app and you type something out and you screenshot and you post it. And basically just saying like, hey, if you're a ranger, we all feel so bad for you. Like we all have so much empathy for you, so much compassion for you, and we're so thankful for the job that you've done in the past. Like you've given many of us some of our best memories. And that post just like took off like wildfire. Like I couldn't even open Instagram on my phone because it would just like glitch from all the notifications. And in the course of a couple weeks, my platform like exploded from, I think I had like 15,000 followers before that, and it jumped up to like 75,000.
Dang.
Over the course of like 4 weeks. And I was like blown away by this.
Wow, you can't predict these things. It just
exactly.
happens.
Yeah, it just happens. And so that to me was like, all right, I feel like I've learned a lot over the past 2 years about the history of the parks, about the way the National Park Service runs. I feel like I'm in a position to kind of be a humble voice in all this, trying to provide some clarity. And that's how I came to where I am now. My first Substack post was just a template letter for Congress about the firings, and that took off, and here we are now. So that's kind of my origin story.
Well, and you have become and your Substack has been a really great resource for me as a writer, also just trying to amplify it, because I think that there's like these interconnected platforms that are helping to advocate and also kind of paint a picture of the intersectionality of a lot of the issues that we're experiencing. Like there's a what is it, Beers and Beans on Instagram. Like I they're very advocacy focused, but also you know, how does this intersect with the war on Gaza and the bombings in Iran or war in Iran, which for those who are listening, I think we're 2 weeks into the war by
I think I saw like 13 days today or something.
Yeah. By the time we're recording this, so we have no idea where it's going to be at when you hear this. So, thank you for doing that, because it's really helpful to have these kind of these I guess North Stars to figure out like what we need to be doing, what we can do, and to share it with other people. One of the things I wanted to know, especially like the learning the history. I mean, I think I love that so much, because it is really hard to find the history of the parks, even at some of the parks. We also went to Capitol Reef in November, and I was really impressed too. Capitol Reef, Bryce, Zion, they have great, so does Yosemite. We've gone to some parks that have some really great literature, but it's, you know, you can't tell the full story in these plaques and junior ranger books and all of that. But I learned the most from the junior ranger literature, doing those with my son, because and I advocate adults to do them too, because they're so informative, and I wouldn't know half the things I do about the parks if I didn't do those along with my son. So what were some kind of aha moments for you when you started out on this research? What was what were some things that you realized was a history that was kind of untold, and you know, the vast majority of people wouldn't know this going to the parks?
I would say it's always interesting to think about the concept of untold history, because as somebody who interacts a lot with the history, you know, there's things that you come to know that like the people that know the history all kind of settle on the same themes. All right. But when you're first entering into it, you're like, holy cow, why did I never know about this before? You know, it's kind of like there's two worlds at times when interacting with what we know about the past. There's like an in-group and an out-group. And the out group is always like, this stuff is crazy. Why did my history teacher never tell me this? And the people that are in are like, we've been talking about this forever. Yeah. Which is, you see that discourse all over the place.
100%.
So if someone's listening to this and they are familiar with a lot of the history, they're going to be like, well, everyone knows that. But, you know, as someone that entered into this just a couple years ago, to me, some big ahas. I think a first one would just be the intentionality around the founding of the National Park Service. You know, the first 40 years or so, between 1872 when Yellowstone was established and 1916 when the National Park Service was established, these are really like loosey-goosey years. You know, you've got 12 national parks that get created, a handful of national monuments, and there's really no founding unifying philosophy behind them. Some of them are huge, like Yellowstone. Some of them are tiny, like Crater Lake.
Well, and Yellowstone was established before, like, there was a National Park Service. And, right? And
there's no plan
there. It's just like,
So one of the things that I discovered in some of my like initial research, I was reading the diary or the autobiography of Horace Albright, who was one of the founders of the National Park Service and the second director of the National Park Service, was just how intentional he and Stephen Mather, who was the first director, and a handful of other men and women were around creating kind of the guiding philosophies of the Park Service that we still observe all the time, every time we enter a national park. Like every time you go to a national park and you get out and you take a picture next to the sign, the reason why that sign is the way it is to mirror the aesthetic of the natural resources protected in the park. You know, it's this idea called parkitecture. And that is like a very, very intentional concept that they came up with. That the idea that every national park has at least one kind of unifying road that goes through it. Like Shenandoah National Park, got Skyline Drive that goes all the way down the spine of it. That is another like really intentional concept that they came up with to say, like, we kind of want parks to have uniform experiences. And so we're going to make sure that some of these things, that people can predict what's going to happen to them when they go into a park. So that was one thing that really jumped out to me, was just the incredible intentionality. And then another thing which really kind of holds a spot in my heart as an Easterner, someone in Michigan, which is how the Eastern parks came into existence, is that it was essentially that like a need was recognized, that they said, we've got all these parks out in the West. At that point, when they started talking about the Eastern parks, the only park east of the Mississippi was Acadia in Maine, which is remote in its own way. And all of the parks out west, like Glacier and Yosemite and Yellowstone, hard to get to. And so people started to say, we are making the case for these parks based upon health benefits and recreation. And we also need to solidify the National Park Service as a national government agency. And so they started like scouting areas in the East to turn into national parks. And the first 3 that were established as a result of that scouting trip were Shenandoah, Great Smoky Mountains, and Mammoth Cave. And that to me was also like really fascinating. This idea of, it wasn't just like Smokies are cool, let's make them a national park. It was like, that was part of an intentional search to make sure that all Americans were getting a full experience of the National Park Service. So there were a few things that were kind of big aha moments for me.
That's cool. Yeah, it's super interesting. Well, and wasn't Frederick Law Olmsted was a part of the founding of the parks too, so it can it's not surprising that there's this like parkitecture element to it too. So one of the things that you mentioned a lot in your book too, is kind of the mythology surrounding the parks, and also that mythology and this kind of goes back to some of the, like, even the intentionality behind it was also intentionally moving the people out of the places. So like, the indigenous peoples in Yellowstone, but also the people who lived in the Appalachian region were all moved out, like for the Smoky Mountains National Park. So this mythology that erased this presence of people in all of these places. So this is a topic of conversation that's come up a lot in almost every conversation that I've had for the podcast. And so I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you've learned from your research, especially, and how did you find information about kind of the indigenous history of these places? And I mean, I think there's, it's kind of scattered, like the information is scattered depending on which tribes were there and how they were displaced, and whether there's kind of an existing vibrant culture. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll talk first about, this concept of mythology. One of the things that I teach my students, like I said, I teach 7th grade history, very ancient history focused. And, so kids always ask, are we going to learn about mythology? Are we going to talk about Zeus and all sorts of stuff? And I say, yes, but we talk about mythology as more than just like, these are interesting stories. As a history teacher, one of the things that I try to make sure that my students come away with is the idea that all societies create mythologies, whether it is like how we would consider them to be in like a religious sense, or whether or not it's just like a kind of foundational myth that is as you can think of it as like the spring from which pours forth our deeply held ideas and beliefs. All religions have a founding myth. All political ideologies have a founding myth. All countries have a founding myth. And the national parks have founding mythologies to them. There's kind of a writ large founding mythology around Yellowstone, which is something that I talk about a lot in my book that just came out. But each individual park, I think, also kind of has some founding mythology to it. And the thing about mythology is that it is, when we think about mythology, we always think about it as that's something that's not true. But, there's always kernels of reality to them, and for Yellowstone, kind of the mythology that's born out of it is something that I talk about as the geyser lie. I don't remember if I read that someplace, but it's what I ended up using in my book to describe kind of a core part of this mythology, one piece of this mythology. And the geyser lie is the concept that indigenous people didn't inhabit the area that became Yellowstone National Park because they were afraid of the geysers, because they had kind of a superstitious spiritual fear of the geysers, which when you dig into the ethnography and some of the work that historians did closer to the founding of Yellowstone, it's just not true. Like, it's a very obvious lie. And I ended up digging into some of the reports of one of the first superintendents of Yellowstone National Park. His name was Philetus Norris. And there's a very intentional way that he describes indigenous people of Yellowstone as a way to kind of craft this stereotype around them, all right, in order to reinforce the geyser lie. And going back to the idea of mythologies, one of the things I teach my students is that mythologies make things tidy for us. They tell us a cohesive story, something that's easy to explain to our children. You think about the Thanksgiving story. That's a tidy mythology that's easy for explaining something. And the same is true of the geyser lie in terms of Yellowstone history, is that it was an easy way of explaining why Yellowstone was an untouched, empty area, a wilderness. All right. In 1872, this geyser lie was used in order to make the park feel safe for people. There was, I won't give it away because I write all about it in the book. But there's all kinds of events happening around Yellowstone just after its founding that are pretty scary. All right. There's war happening around Yellowstone. There's the dispossession of indigenous people that's happening around Yellowstone, and the resistance of indigenous people happening around Yellowstone. And there's things that happen in Yellowstone National Park that, if it made national headlines, would make people not want to go and visit. It would make them afraid. And so the administration of Yellowstone and its early boosters formulate this mythology to say, you don't need to worry. You can come and have a nice, safe vacation here. You can come and check out all the wild animals. There's nothing else here to worry about. Okay? Yeah. So a lot of ideas in there.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I really like this, the way you described what a mythology is. It does make you start to think back on like how I think history today is taught very differently than I think it probably was 20, 30 years ago when I was in in growing up. But I think that's so important to think about too, because it for kids and for adults too, is that we need to be critical thinkers about the narratives that are being told about places. Who is telling the narrative and what kind of story are they telling? And like you said, a mythology is an easy story to tell. It's in a way a little bit of propaganda, and that's kind of how they were able to explain away it's hard to say what the American people would have felt if they knew that these places also existed because indigenous peoples were displaced, but it was tidy, and it's wild that it's also like kind of stuck with us for this long, because the dominant voices are still European Americans, and so I really appreciate the way you described what a mythology is, and that's something that a couple of my other guests have also touched on too, is this like American myth is like something that we're really, I think a lot of people are coming to terms with in general, and the national parks are really a part of that kind of frontier myth, the pristine wilderness myth.
Yeah, and it's a tricky thing because like I said, any mythology I don't think is inherently bad. I think it's just important to recognize what the purpose of it is, in that mythologies do hold truth to them to a degree, that they're born out of realities, and it's just a question of how is that reality being formed and shaped in order to, as you said, fit into a specific narrative, and I think that it's worth noting that the mythology about wilderness that has grown up around the national parks, there's a lot of ways that we can point to it and say this is not a true thing. Okay, this idea of, as the Wilderness Act would put it, this idea of landscapes that are untrammeled, untouched by man, places where man and his works, have not had an effect on the landscape. Like we know that that's not real. We know that people have been living on this continent, since time immemorial, and have had an effect on the various parts of the continent in various ways. And so like we're able to see through kind of the lack of dimension there. But I think it's also worth noting that like the myth of wilderness has also done a lot of good, in the sense that, without this concept of wilderness, which is a pretty uniquely American concept, we wouldn't have the public land system that we have today. In that, even though we can point to a lot of wrong that has happened in establishing our public land system, something that I felt like there was kind of a moral burden to write about in my book. My chapter on Glacier, I spend mostly just talking about the Blackfeet who were dispossessed in order to create Glacier National Park. Even though we can recognize the wrongness there, we can also say there is, some good that comes with this, and we should take both together and try and figure out how do we create a more just future out of the two of them. I think it's kind of my takeaway. I wrestled with some of the things that I was learning about in order to do the research for this book. One phrase that I kept on leaning on was that, like, these hard stories, about the geyser lie in Yellowstone, about the dispossession of the Blackfeet and Glacier, the phrase I use is that they should recolor the way that we see the national parks.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that we should throw them out completely, right? It just means that we should think more deeply about what these stories mean for how we understand the landscape and how we experience the landscape, how we continue to enjoy the landscape, but just that we should start to think about moving in ways that allow the stories to motivate us towards something better in the future, something that is more just, which is kind of, I wrote a postscript to the book that was kind of trying to tie some of these things together. And that was one of the things I wrote about specifically, was just the idea that particularly it's a terrible story of injustice. But there are movements that are being made in recent years to say, how can we move the story of this park more towards justice, more towards undoing some of the wrongs that have been done to the Blackfeet for the sake of this place?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I'm having that similar experience as well in working on this book, because I mean, honestly, I come at it probably from a more critical perspective, just because it's like how I'm constitutionally built. But then, again, like you said, last year during the Valentine's massacre and like the firing of all of these rangers, it really did create a moment where it was like, we cannot lose these places, and we can't. And I think that everybody agrees that with that. I think it's the same thing with a lot of the indigenous peoples who have ties to these locations. We live in this kind of like paradoxical state where we have to acknowledge the history, because that helps us understand it, and also like leads to kind of a more just future, and even a place where we can protect really protect the parks even more. Like, a lot of the kind of reparations work that's happening with the Blackfeet and other, it's not black and white. Like, we can still critique the past while also appreciating and fighting for these public lands. And I am there with you 100%, because it's a struggle, especially as a white person doing this work too, because it's like, I've really had a big learning process over the last 6-7 years about just the indigenous stamp on this continent that I knew nothing about growing up, and it was not taught in history classes, because it was very much from the Eurocentric perspective. I think and hope that's changing. I mean, if we have teachers like you that are bringing that perspective, but then also like realizing it's just about asking questions and continuing to learn and knowing that we can't know everything. And and one thing that I've really learned through this process, and that I wrestled with at times, is just trying to figure out, like, as a white person, as a white male, I embody certain positions in society, and especially in terms of national parks, which have been historically white male spaces. One of the people that I write about in my book, George Bird Grinnell, I mean, he's like the archetype of white male conservationist. He's super privileged, he grew up rich, all those sorts of stuff. And it is something to wrestle with for me personally. And kind of the place that I landed at is just trying to figure out, like, how do I try to put aside guilt, because I think that's unproductive, and figure out, what am I equipped to do? And to me, what I decided that I was equipped to do was to write this book, and to make sure that it included these stories. I was thinking to myself, I'm equipped as an educator, as a communicator, as someone that's built a following. And so my part in all of this is not
creating, hikes to get African American youth into a national park. It is not about connecting the Blackfeet back to their homelands or anything like that. My role here is to be the storyteller, then make sure that these stories aren't lost and that more people have access to them, while at the same time recognizing, what my position is in all of that. Just trying to figure out what can I do. And this is what I've decided I can do.
Well, and I think so many of us are in that position with the fight for public lands, but also just in the fight around climate change, because it feels so big. So how can I figure out what to do? And I'm the same way. I'm a writer. I'm using the gifts that I have to kind of bring my perspective to it. And also, like, to showcase or model, I guess, that learning too, is that, like, we don't have to go into this place just being like, ooh, they're critiquing white people, I'm going to, I have to step away, but really actually leaning into the discomfort and learning more. Well, and this is a good segue into kind of the advocacy stuff. We're in this, you've already talked about this a little bit, but we're in interesting times with the unprecedented attempts to hack away at not only a National Park Service, but just public lands writ large, which is a lot of land in the United States. Yeah. What do you think individuals like the listeners of this podcast can do to advocate for and help save the parks and public lands? I mean, what can we do?
So I would say that the first thing is find someone you can trust, okay? Like you said, I've become that for some people, which is mantle that I, in some ways, don't recognize myself in. I have to tell people, like, I fell into this whole thing accidentally, and I'm trying to just figure it out as I go, okay? And luckily, I have gotten connected with
humility will get you very far, too.
I've gotten connected with some really great experienced people through the Valentine's Day massacre. I ended up kind of accidentally in a Signal group chat with a whole bunch of other online public land creators. Cool. And just the connections I've made through that and the ways I've been able to kind of pick some people's brains and just ask them, like, hey, what do you think the best ways to communicate this? Does this call to action like really work? What should I be focusing my energy on? I've just learned so much from other people. And so that would really be the first thing I would say, is figure out who can you learn from. Maybe that's me, maybe that's others. There's so many people that are doing just excellent work.
And we can put some links in the show notes too. Because I mean, the information is, there are a lot of resources that are really on top of the news too.
Totally.
Like, I am a resource, but I also am I'm not a breaking news writer. Yeah. So I am usually late to the game to posting about things. So we will put some links in the show notes so that people can keep an eye out on those.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because I also kind of had to figure out last summer when the whole public land sale was happening with Mike Lee and the One Big Beautiful Bill. I had to decide, like, am I going to try and be a breaking news person? And I decided that I couldn't, that it just didn't work with my life. I have a 3-year-old, a 9-month-old, and I work full-time as a teacher. So I was like,
say no more.
On top of this. And that too was also like figuring out, like, how do I stay in my niche? If you spend any time looking at how to win on social media, it's all about figure out what your niche is. And I was like, my niche is to try and add some perspective, with whatever perspective I can bring. That's what I'm going to do. And it's usually going to come from something from the past, from some event from the past. So to kind of bring it back around, try to figure out who can I learn from, whether that's somebody on Instagram that you're like, they do breaking news and I want to be following that, or if somebody writes really great call scripts, oftentimes the call to action is call your senator or call your member in the House. If someone writes really great call scripts, or if they just have a really good way of explaining things, I would just latch on to that one person, and there are a lot of people that are doing kind of the same work. And so find your person. So that'd be the step one. And then step two is, like I said, just figure out what you are equipped to do. It's so easy to start to feel guilty. I feel it at times. I'm like, I didn't call my senator today.
I know.
What if the terrible thing happened and it's because I didn't personally put on enough pressure? And I guess I just feel like to a degree we need to start getting a little more allergic to guilt and start saying,
I mean, that's what the big oil, what the the people in power who are doing all these bad things want us to feel like, because I mean, that is actually literally the narrative that was created around climate change. The whole language around sustainability and personal action was invented by big oil to blame us for everything, whereas like they were the ones that really had control of that. And so I think that you're right. When you think of that guilt, you're like, this is what they want.
Yeah, totally. And I'm assuming that you're someone that's on the left, and that's how I would describe myself too.
Oh yeah, I'm
like, we're so good at weaponizing guilt. We're so good at it. At not saying something the right way, at saying, why didn't you know this already?
Especially
at saying,
as
why
white people are really good at
it. And it's just, I think we really need to do something about that impulse. And I think that impulse is to say, what am I realistically equipped to do? Am I realistically equipped to call my senator every day? If so, then I should try to do that. Am I realistically equipped to call them once when I see the call to action? If so, then I need to be satisfied with my capacity to act. That's something that I've really been wrestling with, and that I really encourage people towards. It's just what can I actually do, and to say, once I've done it, I've done it, right? And maybe at another time you can do more, but to just do what you can do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that it all builds up. Because that would be my third thing, is that I would say we really need to believe that our advocacy works.
Yeah, and it does. I mean, it has worked.
Yeah.
I mean, all of Mike Lee's proposals up until now have failed because of public advocacy.
Exactly.
And, I mean, he's still at it, so we just have to keep an eye on that nasty guy. But
I think specifically about how right around Christmas and the New Year, how he tried to create that loophole so that national parks didn't have to be owned by the National Park Service anymore.
He's very creative. I'll give him that.
Yeah. And how just the speed at which people mobilized and the outrage that ensued and how quickly that got retracted. I think that that's just such a good indicator of, number one, how the public land community has kind of, like, we've all been trained. I think that we all kind of went through the fire in the first 6 months of 2025. And so we've all been trained. Kind of we got our fast twitch muscles ready to go for things. But that was just such a great sign that, like, we can win these things. Okay, we can win these things. Worth noting that that language did end up getting stripped from the final bill, but it wasn't because of Mike Lee. It's because of other things that happened.
Yeah, totally. Whew, that guy. Yeah, and I also want to go back to kind of finding your place in things too, is that really to encourage looking locally as well. I mean, for the national, like for Mike Lee's proposals and stuff that is happening at the federal level, yes, you call your senators or your Congress people. But then there's a lot happening locally, and the environmental advocacy groups locally are doing incredible work. So, like, for example, I'm in Portland, Oregon. There's currently this is a federal thing, but I think that we can work locally with our senators here. There's currently a proposal to push logging back to like 1960s levels of scale, which was cutting down lots of old growth forests. I actually wrote a lot about this on the Substack, because this is just, logging is talked about a lot in Oregon, and there was a whole podcast series in like 2020 about the timber wars, and kind of which kind of, you know, came out of this 1960s era logging and moved into the environmental activism in the 70s and 80s, but which also created a real big divide between environmentalists and locals, which is also the divide that the timber industry thrives on, because they're the enemy, yet we're fighting against each other. So, and then, you know, for example, now data centers, some, you know, are related to public land, but I think that they could affect a lot of the environment, the public lands. Like data centers is the big thing. And I think that showing up at town halls has a notable effort to stop these projects. And like we're having this debate for a data center in the Columbia River Gorge near Hood River, and which could do a lot of damage to the water systems. And so I think that's another thing too, is that you don't just have to focus on the federal. I mean, yes, we all need to be paying attention to the shenanigans of Mike Lee and his cronies, but we also can have even more immediate effect by working alongside advocacy groups locally.
Totally. Yeah. I was so happy in October to be able to work kind of in coordination with Protect the Porkies, who we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Because, being here in Michigan, when you think public lands and national parks, you always think about the West.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I had done all this advocacy around national monuments in Utah and, national parks here and there and all sorts of stuff. And I'm like, man, I love all those places. I love fighting for them, but I also I want to do something about like this land that I love here that I live on, like I am such a child of Michigan, I get like emotional thinking about the land and water of this place because it was so much of my childhood. And so when the chance was there to use my platform for Protect the Porkies, at the time, the objective was to have a $50 million grant that would be given to this mining company in the Upper Peninsula to build infrastructure. It was going to be in our state budget. And so the alarm bells were raised to say, we really can't allow this mine to go in next to Porcupine Mountains Wilderness State Park, which is right on the edge of Lake Superior. The North Country National Scenic Trail runs right next to it. Just absolutely gorgeous scenic landscapes and an economic driver for the region, which is kind of depressed. We just can't allow this to be destroyed and to be threatened by all the toxic mining waste and stuff. And so to be able to use my platform to fight for something here at home, I was just totally overjoyed by that. And I totally encourage people, like, there is so much energy that comes out when you're talking about someplace that's on your doorstep, someplace that like you like really identify with as like a part of your like local identity.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, public lands aren't just national parks. They are state, even
city parks and trails.
City parks. I mean, I think that's the thing. Like we need to advocate for more of that. I mean, there's so much, and we won't go into this history. I think I've talked about it a little bit with some other guests, but the history around parks and communities of color and how communities of color, lower income communities have way fewer parks and green space near them. And so that is also a really big advocacy and justice issue that connects those. So it's there's so many, like hyper locally, like, there's so much you can do. Okay. So you've already kind of talked about your first book. Do you want to tell us, and a little bit about your newest book, but can you tell us about your newest book and where can people find it?
Yeah. So it's available now. As of when we're recording, it will be live on Amazon. It's self-published, so it will be live on Amazon, and I'm working to get it live through indie bookstores like Bookshop.
Oh, great.
So it should be available in all the places if you don't want to support the behemoths, okay? But worth noting that there are a lot of self-published authors who make their most money off of Amazon. So it is kind of...
being in the writing community, I have a lot of writer friends who self-publish, and that's, it's a love-hate relationship.
It is. Exactly.
So I hear you.
But working to make it available for the people that are trying to not put more money in Jeff Bezos's pocket. So I'll talk a little bit about the origin of this book too. So when I published my first book, A Short History of the National Parks of the Southeast, I was like, this is going to be a series. It's going to be very formulaic. I'm just going to go region by region. And so I thought that my next book was going to be A Short History of the National Parks of the Mountain West. And I was going to include 8 parks in that one, and include the parks on the Great Plains and Rocky Mountain National Park and all that sorts of stuff. And I started with Yellowstone, and I started digging into the history of Yellowstone. I ran into this geyser light idea, and I was like, there is so much more here that I need to explore, that it just kind of kept on expanding. And when I first started writing, somebody gave me the advice. They said, do the research and just tell the story that's there, And that is so simple, but it's actually kind of like a profound guiding star, especially when you're doing history. And there's a lot of swirling stuff, a lot of context. And one writer includes these kind of extraneous details, another includes these, like, which ones do I need to include? And so that research kind of guided me towards really focusing in on the geyser lie And when I wrote that Yellowstone chapter, it was way longer than any of the chapters in my first book. So already I was starting to kind of decide this book's going to look different than the first one. And the same thing happened in Glacier. You know, I started to get into it and I was like, there is such an important story here to tell. I focus on the Blackfeet. I could have talked more about the other tribes associated with Glacier, the Penderel, the Kootenai, but I didn't. I chose to focus on the Blackfeet because I was like, this is kind of a central story here about them and about, you know, that charismatic conservationist George Bird Grinnell, who I kind of view as like a tragic figure in many ways. Like he's got a pretty great resume as a conservationist. He kickstarted the Audubon Society movement. He saved Yellowstone's bison from poachers. Obviously, he works to establish Glacier National Park. He preserves like the ethnographic history of a lot of indigenous tribes in the West, but also he has like the paternalist view of his age, you know, and just has this view of the Blackfeet that they don't benefit from the mountains, and so they might as well get rid of them. And he helps facilitate the severing of the Blackfeet from their homeland in many ways. So that was another story that was like this. Like, I need to really let this be fully fleshed out. You know, I could have written it in a kind of a short and snappy way, but I felt like I needed to fully flesh it out. And then Grand Teton, holy cow. That's a story, all right? It's really dramatic. It lines out over about 50 years, okay? The story of establishing Grand Teton. A small park gets created, but people want a bigger park, and then there's this movement to create a national monument, and then people get ticked off about the national monument, and then finally a big park is created later. And it's just so dramatic, okay, that chapter in my book is longer than the other two combined, just because the story is long.
I'm excited.
Yeah, it's really fun. It's a little bit less heavy than the other two. So that's kind of my book. And then if you take them all together, you know, one of the things that the history teachers I always look for is what's a unifying theme. You know, any number of historians or people could look at these stories and find different unifying themes. And what I kind of discovered by looking at these three parks together, which are all pretty geographically connected, you know, being in that Montana, northern Wyoming area, is that they're all telling a very similar story, okay, about how the idea of what a national park is and who it's for grows out of Yellowstone. How there's a change in that concept with Glacier, and then a further change with that concept in Grand Teton. So that's kind of one of the things that I try to unify them together with throughout.
I'm excited to read your book, and I got a preview of it, and I haven't had a chance to sit down and read the whole thing yet, but I'm excited, and y'all should get it. Is there anything else you think that we haven't talked about that you wanted to let our listeners know?
I mean, I can tell you about my favorite national park.
Oh yeah, tell me about. That was one of the questions I was going to ask you. It's kind of like choosing your favorite child, so I know it's an unfair question, but do you have a favorite park and why?
So my first thought is always like, I feel like my favorite park is the one I went to most recently. You know, like these places that just linger with you for so long. But when I really think about it, my favorite park has to be White Sands.
Oh, really?
And part of that is because I'm a history teacher, and I actually teach about White Sands as part of my curriculum at the start of the school year. Because we don't just do ancient history in 7th grade, we do like prehistory. We start with Paleolithic hunter-gatherers, which includes a discussion of migration to the Americas. And so I talk about White Sands and how it's kind of reshaped everything that we thought that we knew about when people came to the Americas because of the discovery of the fossilized footprints there.
Yeah, the ones that were alongside the sloth, the giant sloth, right? Yeah. That's super cool.
So I love that. And I love it too because, like, to me, the landscape is beautiful, okay? And when I went there, I expected to just be like I'm from Michigan, all right? I've been running around in sand dunes for my whole life, all right? And they're hot and dusty, and you get sand all over you when you're in them. And so I expected when I went to like kind of have that slightly uncomfortable feeling to it, but it's not, because and I always mess this up. They're not gypsum. Maybe they're gypsum. I don't remember what they are. I always mess it up.
Like what the sand is made of?
Yeah, what the sand is, because it's not actually sand. You know, it's something else. But it's not hot like our sand dunes are here in Michigan. It's cool to the touch. Like, you can walk on it.
Interesting.
In your
that is
bare
exactly
feet.
The opposite of how I expect it to be.
Yeah. So being there for me, I always tell people, I'm like, it was kind of a spiritual experience, to be there as a history teacher. This is a place I teach about, and to imagine what it was like 25,000 years ago. But also, when I was there, there's fighter jets flying overhead.
It's like it has a big history with the atomic bomb or the atomic age. Yeah, which is wild. It's like the ancient and the modern, like real clashing. Yeah,
exactly. To me, as a history professor, I'm like the historical paradox of this place, that you have like the beginning of humanity with these footprints and hunter-gatherers, and you have the end of humanity with nuclear weapons that were tested just north of the park. I'm like, the paradox is just too good, and it just speaks to me in so many ways.
I love it. Spoken like a writer too. It's like the narrative that I love it. I love that it's not like I mean, honestly, like my favorite's probably like a very typical national park, but I really love how that is not the stereotypical favorite.
I will credit that paradox to a great podcast by the Washington Post.
I was just gonna say, I was like, Field Trip, is that yes, it's so good.
Yeah, I've listened to it probably 5 times.
Yeah, we'll put that in the show notes, and that was like a huge inspiration for me actually with like this idea, because I just the reporting in it is so good, and just to give folks a little bit of a tiny little background on it, it's created by Lillian Cunningham. She's the journalist in there. And so she travels to Yosemite Glacier. I just pulled it up here. The Everglades and White Sands. Is it really only those 4 places?
And Gates of the Arctic.
Oh, yeah, Gates of the Arctic. I was like, there was another one. And it's so good. And it's like, it's the indigenous history. It's the like development of it. And like you said, how it is in the modern age. And each of the parks had such a different story. It was so fascinating, and with the Everglades, I learned so much about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, whose name I really only knew from because of the school that had the shooting, but she was an incredible conservationist and environmentalist who really kind of calling out the canary in the coal mine with like what was happening in the Everglades and at that period of time. And anyway. Yes.
Yeah.
Big shout out to Field Trip. Cool. Well, this has been awesome, Will. I really appreciate having you here. Where can people find you?
Yeah, under National Park History on Instagram and Substack. And I've started to get a little bit more active on Threads.
Well, we appreciate your advocacy, and also I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and it has been such a pleasure having you here. Thanks for having
thank
me.
you. It's been great to be on. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and like I said, do the history teacher thing and just talk more about what I've learned about what I love.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of Charm of the Wilderness. I hope you felt inspired to appreciate the richness of our public lands and national parks and the vital role they play in the climate justice movement. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share it with your friends. You can also receive these episodes right in your inbox by subscribing to Charm of the Wilderness on Substack. Together, we can raise awareness and foster a deeper connection with nature and each other. Until next time, keep exploring the wild charm around you, and remember, every little action counts in the fight for our planet. Stay curious and connected.